everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we are going to be talking about what matters most, turning personal values into financial strategy. So, we are not talking about beating the market, picking stocks, reacting to the latest headlines. This is a conversation really directed by your life and what that matters to you and how your financial decisions can ultimately support those values. My name is Kali Hassinger. I'm a senior financial planner and partner here at the center. I work with individuals and families every day, often during periods of change, uncertainty, transition. That's when a lot of people want to work with financial planners. And I think what is most gratifying for me in my position is when I get to truly help a client align those values and their lives with their financial plan. At the center, we do not work as a vacuum as financial planners. We have amazing support through our team in the investment department. And I am very excited to be joined today by my team member, Mallory Hunt. She is a portfolio administrator. Mallory, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here, and thank you all so much for joining us today. As Callie mentioned, I have the privilege of working on the center's investment team as a portfolio administrator, and I've been in this role for about 5 years now, and I'm excited to get started today. Our goal is to help you identify what truly matters most to you, and just importantly, how to meaningfully connect those priorities to your investment and planning strategy.
So today, similar to what Mallory just said, we are going to really look at why values matter so much in financial planning. And we're going to walk through how to identify those personal or family values and determine, what really sits at the center for you. What is most important? And from there, we can talk about turning those values into goals, into actionable items, and then ultimately into financial and investment planning strategies. And, when all of those pieces are put together, that is what creates a values-driven financial plan and what that actually looks like in practice. So one of the most important principles in financial planning is this: money is not the goal itself. It is a tool to support you in your life. And when you have, the idea of money in itself, there's always something rooted behind it. Of course, everybody wants enough money to not worry about money, right? But why do we worry about money? It's because of those needs behind it, or those values, those pieces of security that we want and feel that money will provide. One of the other partners at the center, Tim Wyman, he always said, if you have insight to someone's calendar and insight to someone's expenses, and I'm butchering that a little bit, but essentially, money and time are two of our most finite assets in life. And when you look at those together, I think it can provide some insight into your values, whether you're actively aware of them or not. And when you clearly define those values, it can provide that added clarity when things are very unstable. You're going through changes, you're going through periods of uncertainty or transition. And, we work with a lot of clients again during those periods. Market volatility, making the decision to retire can feel very uncertain. You're, turning your savings into a stream of income. You change jobs, divorce, losing a loved one, receiving inheritance. All of these are periods of turmoil, uncertainty. And if you don't have your values clearly defined, decisions can feel very reactionary or based in emotion that isn't in a stable place. So, unclear values can can result in unclear decisions or, you know, unclear values can result in unclear or emotionally based decisions. So a values-based plan can give you something very solid and very certain to return to when those periods of uncertainty show up.
And Callie, you make a great point here, especially when it comes to values serving as a guide during market fluctuations. Having clear values can be incredibly helpful during periods of volatility or uncertainty. They help our clients and investors do one of the most important things we talk about, and that is to stay the course. I know that phrase gets repeated often in investing, but there's a good reason for that. Emotional decisions are one of the biggest threats to long-term investment success. And your goals are typically set during calmer, more neutral times with a clear head. So it's important to remember that when volatility shows up, keep the end goal in mind and avoid changing your plan in reaction to short-term uncertainty. With that being said, your plan does not have to be static. Life changes and goals evolve and markets shift, but we don't want moments of turmoil to drive decisions based on interim panic rather than long-term purpose.
Mhm. And having that, again, that foundation can allow you to make those updates over time in an educated format. When we talk about values, we're talking about what actually drives decisions. So, um, I mentioned that time versus money asset, and we may be able to get some insight on our values from the ways we spend our time, the ways we currently spend our money, but there might be some deeper desires behind, the day to day. So taking some time to really reflect and think what is most important to you and taking the time to also prioritize those. So on the screen, we have some very common values, right? Family security and independence. Everyone wants to feel like the people we love are taken care of and will be okay even if we're not around. Community involvement, whether that's volunteering or through donations, freedom and flexibility of lifestyle. I think of retirement. That's a goal for many of our clients. They want that freedom from working. How do we get there, and what do you want to use or do during that time when working is not, the primary time of your days? If working is not where we spend the most hours in our days. And then legacy and long-term purpose, what do we want to leave behind when we aren't here? And so most people identify with more than one of these, and the goal is not to pick just one. It's to understand which one carries the most weight so that your financial plan can reflect what truly matters.
Yep. And while values are deeply personal, the idea of clarity and intention doesn't just stop at the individual level. In fact, we believe in them so strongly that we've taken that same values-based approach at the center and we've translated it into clearly defined goals that guide how we operate, both in our day-to-day work and even in the investment decisions we make on behalf of our clients. So what you're seeing on the screen here is essentially our North Star here at the center. These are the values that we truly take pride in and strive to live out every day. And they're not just words on the slide. If you come into the office, you'll find them on the walls, you'll see them on our website. We truly do live by them. Throughout the month, team members submit nominations when they see a colleague exemplifying one of these values in action. And at our monthly all-staff meetings, one of those nominations is selected, and that individual gets to display our values trophy that we have on their desk for the whole month. And their nomination is also highlighted in our Centerview newsletter that everyone can see. So this is really just a great example of how we really do practice what we preach when it comes to living our values.
Hmm. Yes, having those values in front of our faces at the forefront every day, it just is always a good guide, and it does allow us to create goals, just like we're talking about now. The the more your values are defined, the easier it is to take that next step and create goals. So we know the why. Values are the why behind what we want to accomplish, and the goals are how we get there. Take, retirement, for example. We know, that's the goal, that's where we want to be, but why? We want more time. We need to have X amount saved. And that ultimate value can help us, again, more clearly define that goal. Again, there's probably going to be some competing goals, some competing values. Every year when we meet with clients, when we meet with new clients to develop a new plan, asking them what their short-term and long-term goals are is always part of our process because we need to account for those in differing time periods. However, again, going back to that idea that money is a finite asset, there's always going to be a trade-off. We need to prioritize those goals, and the planning process allows us to do that by taking a hands-on look at what the outcome is when we prioritize different goals. Do you want to retire early, or do you want to spend more in retirement? Which goal is more important to you? And seeing that trade-off in real time, I think can make it real and can allow a decision to be made with the education, the information, which is always helpful, but also to just feel more intentional. So when we work with clients and we have, their values defined, they've shared their goals, and together through the planning process, we've prioritized those goals, then we can really look at, okay, how are we going to implement these through financial planning strategies? And I think one of, just because I think when we hear the term values, we think of those emotional pieces, giving to charities, sharing with families. That is what Mallory and I are going to discuss today. Of course, these are not all exhaustive strategies. These are just some of the common strategies that we implement with clients on a day-to-day basis.
What you were just talking about actually brings another quote to mind from a very wise man that we've actually already quoted in this webinar today, Tim Wyman. He often says, when your vision is clear, your decisions are easy. And I think that really resonates and just fits with everything that we've talked about so far, especially in times of uncertainty. When your vision and your values are clearly defined, it becomes much easier to know what to do and how to move forward. Clarity can give you confidence and help keep decision making grounded rather than reactive because you know that it is built off of thoughtful values that matter to you.
So, again, starting or thinking of that charitable giving, what do we often implement with clients? Two of the charitable strategies that I always immediately think of are donor advised funds and qualified charitable distributions from IRAs. We'll talk about those in more detail, but please, I like to reiterate this with clients. If you're going to give, please be as efficient with those dollars as possible. And most often that's through tax efficient planning, where we as your planner can come in and partner with you.
Callie just mentioned donor advised funds, so let's spend a few minutes talking about what they are and why they can be such a useful planning tool. Simply put, a donor advised fund is a charitable giving account. You start by contributing to the fund, most commonly with cash or appreciated stock, which gives you an immediate tax deduction in the year in which the contribution is made. From there, you can take your time deciding which charities you'd like to support and when to make those donations. So people typically use these for a few key reasons. First one is that it simplifies giving in a really intentional way. It allows you to make a tax smart contribution in the year it makes sense for you, while still being thoughtful and values driven about when and where your charitable dollars are ultimately distributed. Another is tax efficiency. And this is a particularly effective planning tool for highly appreciated assets, especially stocks, which this allows you to potentially avoid capital gains taxes while supporting the causes you care about. Another is flexibility, and this is one of the core planning benefits. You contribute now, as we mentioned, and then take your time deciding which charities to support and when to make grants that align your giving with your values and long-term goals rather than feeling rushed into making a decision in the moment. And then lastly, potential growth. While assets remain in the donor advised fund, they can be invested at your direction, allowing your charitable dollars to grow tax-free and potentially increase the overall impact of your giving. Now, one important thing that I would like to mention is that once a contribution to the fund has been made, it is considered irrevocable. So this means that the cash or funds that you've contributed technically no longer belong to you. They belong to the organization that sponsors the fund. However, you do still drive the decisions and advise how the funds are granted to qualified charities. You just don't control the account outright. When it comes to using appreciated stock to fund the donor advised fund, our role is to help identify which holdings make the most sense to give. So we typically start by looking at stocks that have appreciated the most, especially those with low cost basis, since gifting those can help maximize the tax benefit while avoiding capital gains taxes. From there, we also consider things like overall diversification, making sure the donation aligns with your broader investment strategy and your charitable goals. So the idea here is to be intentional, choosing assets that are efficient to give without disrupting your long-term plan. Callie, I don't know if you want to jump in here with anything that I may have missed as far as planning focused items or anything like that.
I think the donor advised fund, you gave a great foundation on how we use it. And it's a nice way for clients to almost create their own family foundation in a very approachable way, because they can also elect a beneficiary to manage those funds, when they die. So we have clients who have a donor advised fund established. They're managing the grants and donations now, but when they pass, those funds will be managed by a family member and allow them to, again, continue implementing their values through their financial plan by giving to charities that the family cares about. Now, the next option, a qualified charitable distribution, is a little bit different than the donor advised fund because it is only available to individuals based on a type of account and an age. So to utilize a qualified charitable distribution, you must have an IRA and the funds must be sent directly to that charitable organization. The distributions are completely tax-free. So if you think of a traditional pre-tax IRA, all withdrawals are taxable unless with this strategy, the funds are sent directly to a charity. However, not everyone with an IRA can use this. You must be at least 70 and a half years old. So the kind of cool piece of this is it used to be aligned with required minimum distribution age, which is when you have to start pulling money out of an IRA. So you're forced to take a predetermined amount out of your IRA each year. However, that age is now later than 70 and a half, but they have not changed the qualified charitable distribution eligibility age. They've also increased the annual limits. So you can donate up to $111,000 a year tax-free to a charity through your IRA or retirement asset. Again, this is only available for IRA accounts. So if you have funds in an old 401k or an old 403b and you're over 70 and a half, you would need to roll those funds into an IRA to take advantage of this option. But this is a great way for people to be very tax efficient with this charitable giving strategy. Again, typically any withdrawals from this account are taxed at ordinary income rates. This remains completely tax-free. So for many clients, again, even if they're not in RMD or required minimum distribution status age, if they want to give to charities and they have an IRA, we're talking to them about gifting directly from the IRA. So, keep this in mind. If you're already giving to charities, you're over 70 and a half or approaching that age. But this is a very common strategy that we use with clients. We just talked about charitable giving strategies, which I think can be top of mind when we think of using money and values together to support causes we care about. But on that value slide, one of the first tiles was family and friends. And so when clients want to use money or wealth to support family, friends, or causes that may not be, considered necessarily under that same tax charitable cause, again, we just want to make sure that we're as tax efficient as possible. And there are times when that can mean actually looking at the recipient's tax status. So, for many of our clients, we're helping them define these values and these goals. But if one of those goals is to gift to family, could it make sense to actually look at the tax rate or income of that recipient? And, in that case, we're doing some tax differential planning. So looking at the tax bracket of the individual who's gifting as compared to the individual who is going to receive that gift. That, can be implemented through gifting appreciated securities. So the gifter may be subject to capital gains tax based on their other income. If the individual who they want to support is in a lower tax bracket, they may be able to receive that security as a gift and actually pay 0% on those capital gains. So the cost basis, the initial investment price of that security is passed along. But again, if that individual is at a lower tax rate, we may have ultimately, given that gift without creating tax for the initial holder and met that goal of supporting the individual. If you don't want to just gift, there's also the option to loan money within family and friends. As planners, we're always thinking about the legal implications of that. So you always are going to want to make sure you consult an attorney and have those things in writing. But you still may be able to loan money to a family or friend that you care about. Again, so just being as efficient as you can with those dollars, but still accomplishing those goals. Another area where we can help clients to align their values with their financial plan is through estate planning and investment management, and often very clearly identifiable through beneficiary designations. So, clients may come to us and they already have their beneficiaries elected on their accounts. But again, we want to make sure that these are as efficient as possible. So if there are those competing goals of leaving money to family, leaving money to charitable causes, we want to make those dollar for dollar gifts as impactful as possible. Pre-tax assets, when passed to a charitable organization, are not taxed. So if we're working with a client, we have that competing goal, charitable gift, leaving money to their family and friends, we're going to say, what about leaving that IRA money, taking a step further, leaving IRA specific assets to the charity? Next step, looking at the individual beneficiaries. Could, the additional pre-tax assets be left to someone in a lower tax bracket? and maybe those tax exempt, think Roth IRA assets, be left to someone in a higher tax bracket. So it's not, just looking at as is today, taking the next step and seeing how that money will impact the next generation or who receives those funds.
When we talk about our investment approach, it really starts with alignment, making sure that your values and your goals are reflected in how your portfolio is built and managed. Investing should not feel disconnected from what matters most to you. And values can also show up in how investments are managed. So when we think about aligning values and goals with investment strategies, that can sometimes lead us to values-based or ESG investing. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it really just means considering additional factors alongside traditional financial analysis. And this approach is not about sacrificing discipline. It's more about understanding risks and opportunities through a broader lens when it's appropriate. And from there, alignment continues through ongoing account management. This can include things like rebalancing, monitoring the portfolio over time, and making adjustments as markets change or as your life and goals evolved, which we touched on earlier. The idea really is to keep your portfolio aligned with your plan, especially during periods of volatility or uncertainty. And finally, security selection is where strategy meets execution. We evaluate individual investments not just for their performance, but for how they fit into the overall portfolio and your long-term goals, whether that includes diversification, risk management, or specific values-based considerations. Ultimately, this approach helps remove emotion from the investment process. When your values and goals are clearly defined, your portfolio becomes a tool to support these priorities, making it easier to stay the course even when markets become unpredictable. Now that we've talked about how values can show up in an investment portfolio, I want to spend a few minutes walking through the centers investment approach. And this is going to be the same for both our traditional and our social strategies. The core construction fundamentals that form the backbone of any successful investment strategy will not change even if we add on that ESG layer. Those fundamentals are just central to our process. So items like asset allocation and diversification play a critical role in long-term outcomes. For example, asset allocation is the mix between stocks and bonds and other assets. And it's one of the most important decisions in an investment plan, and it really helps set the foundation for everything else. It's something we thoughtfully determine with clients based on your goals, your time horizon, risk tolerance, and values, and it can evolve over time as life circumstances change. And diversification, meaning the spreading of investments across different asset classes, different sectors or strategies, that's another core pillar of our investment philosophy, and it's really a key driver of long-term success. Values-based considerations can be incorporated within that framework, but they don't really replace the disciplined portfolio construction. While individual security selection plays a role, it's just one component of a much broader process, and it's the overall structure of the portfolio that has the greatest impact over time. From there, our strategies are evaluated using a rigorous due diligence process that combines both quantitative and qualitative analysis. And there are really 4 key areas that we focus on. First, we look for managers and firms that demonstrate consistency and discipline and a clear investment philosophy. We want to understand how they make decisions, how they manage risk, and whether their approach has been applied thoughtfully over time. Then we look at evaluating performance across full market cycles. And this really helps us filter out short-term or trend-driven results and focus on strategies that have demonstrated durability over time. Third, we meet directly with fund managers and representatives from these companies before we add any strategy to our portfolio. And that doesn't stop even after the strategy is implemented. We have ongoing monitoring, and that's really critical to our process. I'd say we probably meet with representatives from the funds that we hold in our portfolios at minimum once a year. And finally, we regularly review these funds for consistency and continuity. We really want to ensure that each strategy continues to serve the purpose that we intended it and that it remains aligned with its role in the overall portfolio. So altogether, this process is designed to support a disciplined and thoughtful investment approach, and one that stays aligned with your values and long-term goals and supports what matters to you. And I'll even go back to what I said earlier about how this process helps us stay aligned with our goals as not only an investment department, but as a firm.
So, all of these strategies we discussed, incorporating the investment asset aspect, estate and charitable giving, um, giving to family members and using those pieces, all of these strategies ultimately need to be aligned with your holistic, all-encompassing financial plan. None of them are meant to exist in a vacuum. So when we're looking through this, you really need to make sure that when you're prioritizing the gifting, your own security and financial plan is ultimately the number one priority. And that's what we function or are our role as a planner. It's not, as Mallory has said, a one-time event in your life. Updating your financial plan throughout your life as your values evolve, as your goals evolve, is extremely important. And we can work with clients, as those changes occur to reprioritize and maybe incorporate more goals as able, but ultimately rooting it in that financial plan, the level of risk that you're comfortable with, that your plan can withstand, and updating that throughout your life. So, if you're leaving, Mallory and I hope that you walk away with today is that your values do deserve a seat at that planning table. Um, Using money and financial strategies to bring those values to life can be extremely gratifying, but you just want to make sure that you're doing it, again, as efficiently as possible, incorporating those financial planning aspects and updating it as your plan and your life evolve in time. Thank you all so much for joining us today. If you have any questions or want to discuss any of the strategies that we mentioned today and how you could implement them, don't hesitate to reach out. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.